New location unlocked. What's up, everybody? So today I'm going to be reacting to Jeff Nippard's shoulder tier list. One of the things I want to do with this video is put a little bit more of my own personal experience as far as training goes into this reaction than just overall like biomechanics and that kind of stuff, which I do try to include a fair amount of. The reason for that is because the delts are very complex. I don't think there's a solid understanding of their anatomy and biomechanics that all the experts agree on. So I figured for this, one of the best things that I could do, one of the most valuable things I could do is just keep it simple and talk about my own experience as somebody with jacked natty delts. So with that being said, let's get into the video. I'll make Jeff bigger than myself. It's humbling, but let's do it. All right, here we go. First off, first reaction. He looks great with a buzz cut. Jeff, if you're watching this, you look very good with a buzz cut. I'd keep it.
What are the best and worst shoulder exercises for muscle growth? Well, in this video, I'll be ranking the most popular movements on a tier list from S for super to F for fail. And at the end, I'll crown one exercise as the best of the best, raising it to...
Yeah, he looks, I think he looks better with a buzz cut. It's a great look for him. I know I couldn't pull it off. Actually, before I grew my hair out, I just about got a buzz cut. It wasn't quite a buzz cut, but it did not look good on me. I don't know if it's because of the way my face is shaped or whatever. Glasses, I don't know, just doesn't look good. So I decided to just grow my hair out into what I've had the entire time I've had the channel. When I started the channel, I was in the process of growing out my hair, and that's why I started wearing basically hats for all of my videos, was because I was in that awkward phase and it kind of just stuck.
To S tier plus, and I'll pick one exercise as the worst of the worst. For a shoulder exercise to get into S tier, it needs to provide high tension, especially in the stretched position.
All right, so stretch and tension, touch on this real quick. I'm not as sold on this for delts. I find that a variety of resistance profiles not only feel good, but they also work. Keep in mind, I did build the base of most of my delt muscle with mostly short bias stuff. It was a lot of dumbbell lateral raises and variations of that. So this does go a little bit against what usually does work for me, but it is just something to keep in mind. I would also add that the side delt really is tricky to stretch. The rear delt and the front delt, you can stretch a bit more, but in the vast majority of lifts that are popular and practical for the delts, you're really not going to be getting that much of a stretch, at least with much tension. We'll go into more examples of that as he goes through his tier list.
It needs to feel good, which means...
Oh yeah, needs to feel good. One of the pillars of science.
It doesn't cause shoulder pain, and it has a smooth resistance profile. And it needs to have a simple progression. If you can't add weight or reps...
The one thing I would disagree with on this is the simple progression. Progressing your delt lifts is not simple, regardless of what lift it is. Even if it's like easily standardized, like quote unquote heavier loadable lift, like overhead press variations, those are going to be very slow. So progression definitely isn't simple. It does take a lot of patience, but that's going to be the simplest it gets. Anything else that you want to try, your delts are like they're like these tiny little muscles, and they're when you put them all together, it turns into a giant muscle group. But they're these muscles that are surrounded by some of the strongest muscles in your body, and it makes training them and progressing on those lifts extremely tedious. So patience. I don't want to say ignoring progressive overload, because you can't say that as a content creator in the fitness sphere. But what I would say is just being patient, focusing a little bit more on just intensity and just kind of letting progressive overload happen a little bit more passively. I find that's usually the better way to go. If you really try and force things, the traps and the pecs are a lot stronger. They're just going to take over when you're trying to isolate your delts. So it is, progression is definitely more complex on delts, and I think it's okay to just accept that and almost like work around that with your training, instead of saying, reverse pec deck's hard because the traps take over. It's tough to standardize. The range of motion's funky. I'll just stick to standing military press. And it's like, no, you can't just, I don't know, don't get rid of stuff just because it's not like standardized and easy to track.
Over time, I'm knocking it down. The deltoids have three main heads: the anterior or front head, which raises the arm up to the front, the lateral or side head, which lifts the arm out to the side, and the posterior or rear head, which pulls the arm back. Because these heads...
I don't know if I don't think I've ever heard anyone call it the side head or the rear head. Just caught me off guard.
Heads can be thought of as almost separate muscles. I'm going to reveal my #1 exercise for each.
That's a very good point. They really are separate muscles. There's not a lot of crossover between the functions of the delts when it comes to like actually picking your lifts. The side and the front delt can have a good amount of, I guess, just kind of crossover, but the rear delt it functions completely different than the front and side delt. It is a very, very tricky thing, and that's why I think if you just like call delt training like delt training and put it all into one category, you're probably not going about it correctly. I did want to give a shout out to Barbell Apparel, channel sponsor. Right now, they have a free hoodie sale with anything that you spend $99 or more on, and you can stack them as much as you want. So if you want to get, say, a pair of pants, a couple shirts or something that's $99 or above, you get a free hoodie with that. I personally love mine. It's the Break Boundaries hoodie in that rifle green. It's absolutely beautiful. It fits the colors that I love. So shout out to Barbell Apparel. Check out that sale if there's something you're thinking about getting. Get a free hoodie with it.
Each head as we go, hidden behind these 3 doors. Okay, let's start with the most popular shoulder exercise you'll see in gyms all across the globe every day. The standing dumbbell lateral raise. Now, because the side delts are more important for developing an X-frame physique with a tapered look, you'll probably notice that I do slightly favor exercises that target the side delts over exercises that target the front delts. And that's because your front delts already get hit with any chest work in your program, and they're usually overdeveloped relative to the side and rear heads.
That's true, but one thing I've changed my mind on recently is having like extra jacked front delts is never a bad thing. If you look at even like any of the top bodybuilders, if someone has huge front delts, it's a crazy look. It makes your biceps look even better too, because you just get that crazy separation between the bicep and the front delt. In my opinion, the worst look you can have in bodybuilding is having delts that genuinely overpower your arms, but the other way around doesn't look very good either. It makes you look like, I guess, almost a little bit too natural. Not to insult us naturals, obviously, but I think that's very true. If you look at any of the top guys with huge front delts, it looks sick. Natural guys I'm talking about, obviously. If you look at his handle is Kiefe West, KHIFIE, I believe, West. If you look at his delts, like look at his front delts, and that will inspire you to train your front delts and stop saying that they're just kind of a little side piece on the rest of your delts. They already get hit kind of hard and whatnot. And that's just development aside from like your chest training. Of course, you are going to grow your delts from training your pecs. I would say that having overpowering front delts, as long as your rear delts are good, is actually kind of a good thing to have.
Take the dumbbell lateral raise because it's super simple and you can get them done quickly. You can grab a pair of dumbbells a lot faster than you can set up a cable.
Not home gym, guys. Sorry.
Especially if you do cables one arm at a time. So I do think they are the most time-efficient shoulder exercise. I don't think they're the most effective shoulder exercise. That's because you have zero tension on your side delts at the bottom when they're the most stretched. And you don't reach peak tension until your arms are at 90 degrees when the delts are most shortened. But
this is true when you're doing them strict. Cheating can very much so change that, especially on the eccentric and the top half of the concentric. It's going to be tricky to get a lot of tension on the initiation of the concentric. So that can be a little bit, but if you like, I guess, smooth out the concentric and make the eccentric more challenging, you can use a cheat concentric and a strict eccentric, and then just the momentum of you not being able to hold those super heavy weights at the top, but then trying to resist them as you have more leverage at the bottom will make them a little bit more length and biased. So this is a situation where cheating is appropriate if done right, and doing them strict can basically just make them a good old short bias lift. Nothing special, but nothing absolutely terrible. I would say dumbbell side raises did a whole ton for growing my delts. So I'm not going to be biased for them just because of that. But of course, if it worked, it worked. And you can't really disagree with that.
Despite this limitation, they'll still clearly grow your shoulders. This has been proven by real-world examples of bodybuilders who've built
that guy. I don't know who that is. He has pretty big delts, though.
Huge side delts from dumbbell laterals. And I still do these myself whenever I'm pressed for time. But because of the slightly suboptimal tension curve, I'm putting these in B tier.
B tier is a hair low. I think A tier. I don't think there's anything like extra special about them, but I'd probably put them in A tier.
However, if you lean against something, like a bench or a rack, you suddenly modify the resistance curve to place more tension on your side delt when it's most stretched. I think that this is the most effective way to do lateral raises with dumbbells. The lean-in dumbbell lateral raise is going in A tier.
I would probably bump each of them up one notch if we're talking about side delts here. There's getting the stretch, I think, is extremely overrated for the side delts. I mean, you can stretch your front delts, you can kind of stretch your rear delts. You can argue at some point the pecs or the traps are just going to take over for either of those. But with the side delts, where they would need to go to get a good stretch is where your torso exists. And not to be controversial, but I think just having your rib cage, heart, and lungs in place is probably more important than getting a stretch on your side delts. So our anatomy is probably totally fine.
Leaning away might shift some emphasis away from the muscles of the rotator cuff and onto the lateral delt, depending on how you interpret this study, but it still has the issue of not placing high enough tension in the stretched position. So I'm putting these in B tier as well.
Like I said, I'm not worried about how much tension is at the bottom, but what I am in favor of is a descending resistance profile. So something that gets easier as you contract. I just think having an overall length and bias lift along with that descending resistance profile is very useful. It's very easy to standardize because you're not grinding for a lockout. Like it's very clear if you get a rep or not. And then you can just do shortened partials after that to keep milking out probably a little bit more growth. And then still with those partials, you actually continue to get a descending resistance profile. So if you take like a I don't know, barbell curl, dumbbell lateral raise, something that's mid or short biased, like even with those, sometimes going into partials just feels completely useless. Like length and partials, I mean, it feels completely useless because you can barely budge the weight. And as soon as you start to get some momentum, you just hit that wall because it's an ascending resistance profile.
Okay, here's a spicy one, the Super ROM lateral raise. I picked these up from Dr. Mike Israetel when we trained shoulders together, and man, they definitely lit my delts up. I think this is a very rare movement where you actually get the side delt fully contracted. I like that, and even though the trend of the current evidence is converging on the stretch being more important than the squeeze, there's actually very little direct evidence on the shoulders about this. So,
interesting.
I think these are worth trying. That said, because they have the same resistance curve issues as the standard dumbbell lateral raise, they're not quite good enough to get into A tier. I'm putting the Super ROM lateral raise in B tier. I'll get to
B tier is probably appropriate for those. I think you're just going to be limited by how far overhead you or how much strength you have going overhead.
Cables in a second, but first I want to get the most controversial one out of the way. All right, people.
Okay, military press. Yeah, these are very controversial. I'll agree with him on that. This is one of the lifts that it does probably differ from what most of my training philosophy just is in general, and I'll talk about my thoughts on it once he gives his thoughts.
People who like the overhead press really like the overhead press. And I can see why. A strong OHP is one of the most impressive feats of strength that you'll see in the gym.
Bro's clearly never seen a preacher curl.
Actually, I'd say out of all the barbell lifts, I'm more impressed by a big overhead press than I am by a big squat, a big bench, or a big deadlift.
Yeah, I actually I actually agree with him on that. If we're just talking like impressive feats of strength, there's not a whole ton of like cheating or just straight up genetic gifts that give you a massive overhead press. Of course, there is to a degree, but if you look at like look at the guys that are doing 4-inch sumo deadlifts, the low bar good morning squats, the bench presses that don't even budge, like that I agree with him on that. I think just from like a feats of strength perspective, it's turned into a lot of like powerlifting, just turned into a mobility contest. Funny enough, I was thinking about that when I was lifting earlier.
But the question is, how effective is the exercise for building 3D delts? Well, let's see. It does provide high tension on the shoulders in the stretched position.
I would disagree with that. It kind of depends on your personal leverages, but by the time you get into that deep stretch and the bar's like below your mouth or chin level, the tension's just completely dropped off. So you'll notice that like if you're at failure or picking up a weight that's a little bit too heavy for you, you can still budge the weight a pretty good amount. And then when you get to peak resistance, you just get smacked and you just can't really do much. So there really isn't much tension down there. It is exponentially easier. You'll find that it's a mid-range lift. It's very obvious if you just look at the basic mechanics of the lift. The lockout's also very tricky, probably because the muscles are just a little bit weaker up there. But what I would say is if you're not sure how to determine what peak resistance is, this is a situation where, since it is a flat resistance profile, the weight's just going vertical. You'll have to look at the internal strength curves, which will dictate not the resistance profile of the lift, but the actual strength curve. So what happens here is, since your elbows at the bottom are basically below your shoulders, and your upper arm is going to dictate the moment arm for the delts that are being trained, when your elbow is farthest away from your delt, so your shoulder joint, in a horizontal plane, that's when peak resistance will occur. So that's going to be when you're basically your upper arm is parallel to the floor or at a 90-degree angle with your spine or your torso. That's a very quick way to look at it, and that's how it will work for any press or pull variation. Compound, obviously.
You can overload it extremely well.
Although the resistance profile, if you're using a machine or something, can alter that. Just a little asterisk to put in there.
Even though the lift tends to be a stubborn lift, you can usually add a little weight or a rep, or at least improve your technique in some way. And I think that once you nail the technique down, it's a very gratifying lift. So that's all awesome. However, it does have two downsides.
Okay, let's hear them.
One, it's very anterior delt dominant. When we look at activation patterns across the delt heads, you see that the side and rear heads aren't activated much with the over.
I wouldn't pay much attention to EMG. It's fine if you want to use it to start to think about it more. It can give you some food for thought to then research and experiment further, but I wouldn't rely on EMG.
Head press. And for two, because you're standing, it's not the most stable.
It's stable enough. You have a lot of major joints exposed, but it's stable enough. The hips, the knees, the ankles, they're all exposed in this, even the spine. But even though that's not a joint, obviously, but it's fine. It's not the end of the world.
This means your lower body and your core will have to work to keep your balance, which will shift some tension coming from the bar away from your shoulders.
It is true. It's not the most stable lift out there, but it is fine. And part of the reason why this lift, in my opinion, gets the exception, even though I'm a huge promoter of very stable lifts, the lift is stable. It's just not perfectly stable. It's the weight is always going to be over your center of mass, which is great. And since it's a barbell and not locked into like a Smith machine or something, one of the advantages to this is you can shift your head in the way, out of the way, whatever you want to do. Obviously, get it out of the way if you're doing it properly. But you can get the bar, once you get to head height and you clear your head, you can get the bar directly back over your shoulders, kind of over the back of your head. That's going to hit a good amount of side delts, just in my personal experience. So that's why I still kind of like this lift, even if it's a stable lift. It just takes extra work to stabilize, is probably the way I'd put it. It's not like you're trying to press up overhead, like leaning back on a 45-degree bench or something. Like an unstable lift, it's not really this, in my opinion.
That's not a deal breaker, but it's probably not ideal from a bodybuilding standpoint. So all things considered, I think I like the barbell overhead press more than a lot of science-based hypertrophy heads, but I think I like it less than some power building purists.
Yeah, I would say I probably that's he just described the way I feel about it pretty well, actually. I would put it, it's either A or B tier. I mean, I'd be fine with B tier, honestly.
I'm putting it in B tier plus.
Yeah.
I think it's overhated from the science crowd, and I think it's overrated from the barbell crowd. Now,
yeah, okay, Jeff. Yeah, you literally spoke my exact thoughts. We're on the exact same page with that.
If you do them seated, you do fix the stability issue, since you no longer have to worry about your balance. But since they're still very front delt dominant, and there's something about the seated OHP that just isn't as satisfying as the standing OHP, I'm going to leave these in B tier as well.
So I would actually put the seated variation. This is where I would prefer the Smith just a little bit, because that doesn't actually change what muscle's being activated. It just adds the stability. When you're seated, you can't really like you're already angled back since it has back support. You're not up vertical. So it is going to be front delt dominant. And no matter what you do, no matter where you put the bar path, it's going to be front delt dominant. So if you move this to a Smith machine, it's an AD press popularized by Alex Leonidas. So props to him for that. Uh, it is a very, very good lift. I would still prefer it a little bit more on the Smith, but it's not a huge deal either way. I would put the seated variation in like low A tier and probably the AD press in uh at A tier, low S tier, or something like that. Either one of those would be totally fine. I'm trying to like look at his chart, but I keep thinking his S tier is like the S plus thing he does, but I'm realizing that's not the case. That's just a regular S tier. But yeah, either way, they're both pretty good lifts.
If you switch the barbell out for dumbbells, I think a few things improve. For one, you can get your sets done faster. You can grab a pair of dumbbells a lot faster than you can set up a barbell. For two, you can get a bit more range of motion at both the bottom and at the top, especially if you allow the dumbbells to converge. And three, I think you'll get a little more side delt involvement with dumbbells because they have to activate to keep the dumbbells from falling forward or backward. And so I'm going to put these in A tier. The machine shoulder press.
A tier's a little bit high for me on that. The dumbbells are fine to use, but if we're talking about stability, those are much less stable. You'll also find that as you get stronger and have bigger delts, the dumbbells are just going to get in the way. I know it's a very boring argument, but it is just reality. I would also say that I had another point. It just escaped my mind. What was it? Oh yeah. So for most people, and this is just a on paper versus practice thing. In practice, most people on dumbbell presses of any sort, whether it's a flat incline, high incline, low incline, decline, overhead press, like you just showed, you're going to have a tendency to, yes, diverge and converge, but more so with your elbows. You're going to find that your wrists and the dumbbells start to cave in. It just puts a lot more tension on the triceps. So if done properly, that doesn't affect anything. But in practice, that's something a lot of people have to watch out for. They'll keep the dumbbells nice and tight, and that one limit range of motion. And obviously, that's kind of defeats the purpose of his last point. But if done properly, he is correct.
Press is a personal favorite. If you can find a good machine that gets your delts into a deep stretch, I do find that it feels better than dumbbells. And also, since it's less dependent on technique and coordination, you can get your delts all the way to failure without losing control of the weight. It's still going to be very front delt dominant, but as a vertical pressing option for hypertrophy,
yeah, that depends on the machine.
This is usually my go-to these days. It's going in A tier plus. And
I would just put that in S tier. The machine, obviously, he didn't really specify what type of machine. I don't even think he said if it was selectorized versus plate loaded or whatever. They don't make a huge difference because usually there's not a crazy resistance profile change outside of like a prime machine or something. But overall, I would say the selectorized overhead press, even if it's front delt dominant, does exactly the job that it needs to. They also usually have a variety of grips, which sometimes more is better. So I'd be fine with putting that up nice and high. I think it's a great lift. If it's selectorized, you can choose your weight real easy. It really does everything perfectly. The one thing I continue to disagree with, though, is there's just not high tension in the stretch on overhead presses. They're a mid-range lift, and while you can get a stretch, the tension is not very high. So it's a very overrated point, I think.
And it's also my number one exercise for the front delts, making it our first reveal behind door number one. If you
Oh, okay. I missed that. So that's how he's doing it. I would say for front delts, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't really know what could surpass that. I mean, a prime machine, plate loaded, a little bit more length and biased, I'd be fine with. But um, other than that, yeah, I mean, out of what he listed for front delt lifts, yeah, I agree with him there.
If you don't have a good shoulder press machine, my next go-to would be the seated dumbbell shoulder press. All right, this is a cool exercise you may have seen recently on Arnold's Instagram. I'll call it the Arnold-style side-lying dumbbell raise. It looks a bit odd, but
That would not fit in my spreadsheet. It's way too long of a name.
I actually really like it. Unlike a standing dumbbell lateral raise, you get high tension while your delt is stretched, and because you're locked in against.
I wouldn't say high tension, but you do get some tension. Again, this is the same thing where if you look at the resistance profile of the lift, look at this pause right here. The delt is going to be most stretched in this position, but the dumbbell is like 2 inches away from his shoulder. joint in a horizontal perspective. When the dumbbell's halfway up, and the weight would just be like by his side if he was standing up. It's basically just like a cable side raise. So I again, I wouldn't say there's high tension in the stretch. I think that's misleading. But you at least get a stretch if that's what you're looking for. I just think it's overrated.
Against a bench, you'll be nice and stable. You'll get a huge range of motion, and you should get a great side delt pump here. I'm putting these in A tier. For the record,
Yeah, A tier is probably fine for that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'd say it's a perfectly fine lift. You can definitely make gains on that.
front raises of any kind, so dumbbell, cable, or machine, are all going in D tier. I think
Whoa, that is low. I'm curious to hear what he has to say, though.
that if you have any pressing in your program, your front delts are already getting more than enough work, so they don't need any extra isolation. That said, if you're one of the rare few with underdeveloped anterior delts, or if you can't do presses for whatever reason, these will be your go-to. The Atlantis,
I wouldn't put him that low, just because if we're looking at the lift itself, I think it's a totally fine lift. In a program context, it's probably the first thing that will go. If you were to list your favorite lifts for every muscle and put it all in a program, when it's time to actually execute that program, that's going to be one of the first things to go, because you have to look at the program as a whole. But what I would say is that, like I said earlier, giant front delts are a good problem to have, as long as your rear delts and side delts are fine too. So I'm going to push back a little bit on that. I think those big jacked front delts look sick, but I wouldn't say it's a must. I can't remember the last time I did front raises, so I can't be a hypocrite with that. I'd still rank them probably C or B tier, but I mean, yeah, I think the fitness industry's gone a little bit too far with the pushback on front delt training.
this standing machine lateral raise is amazing because it feels so smooth and you get this even, consistent tension on the side delts throughout the range of motion. It's easy to add a little weight or a rep from week to week, and since I've been using it, I've actually gotten so much stronger with it that I'm getting pretty close to maxing out the weight stack. The only minor snag is that since you can't move your arms across your body, you won't get quite as good of a stretch as you will with cables or even with the Arnold lying raise. So it's very close to S tier, but I'm going to tentatively knock it back to A tier plus.
I would put that in S tier. I actually haven't used the one that you hold with your hands, but the commercial gym that I go to it's the Nautilus version, which I love the way the selectorized like machine actually works. So, like the way the weight stack works, it's like an on and off switch for each weight you want to use, which is cool in theory. But when the weight stack is so low to the ground, because obviously your boy's using the heaviest weights possible, and he's blind, you can't really see what switch is lined up with what weight. So I have to like get off the machine, get into like a push-up setup basically, and just try and look at what weight I'm using. It's just a pain. But the even resistance profile is beautiful. The stability on that thing is sick. And yeah, it's great. I mean, he even said that he's gotten super strong on it, so it's proof that it can get you big and strong. It's not like you're cheating your technique and like power building your way to a heavy 1 rep max on that thing. So that's a very viable way to assess your training. I would say it's great. I've used the one with, obviously you grab handles, but the weight is loaded on pads that rest on your elbows. And that one is great because you can make it lengthen biased if you set the seat higher than what you need to be using. So if my normal seat setting is supposed to be 5, if I bump it up to like 2, at the bottom, it sits right on my elbow. By the time, what will happen is since I'm above where I need to be, it will roll up closer to my shoulder, basically reducing the moment to arm and making it more challenging at the bottom. You can take the other, basically the opposite to that, and make it short biased if you like. At that point, I'd say just do dumbbell lateral raises, but that machine has a ton of versatility, and I don't know if he's going to touch on it in this video, but if you have access to one of those, I would definitely use that as much as you can. It's a machine you can kind of spam. I would do a handful of hard sets on it twice a week, and you should be good. That would be S tier, S plus tier, whatever that is for me.
Because of the overload in the feel, it's still an exercise that I do every week though. The seated machine lateral raise is similar, and I include it as well,
Here we go. Yeah, here it is.
But for whatever reason, having the pads higher up on my arms doesn't feel quite as good. That might be because the moment arm to the shoulder is so short that I have to load it with more weight, and that actually cranks my shoulders a bit. I still like these, but I think they're in between A tier and
Oh, Jeff, I disagree so much. If it feels weird on your shoulder, it's my guess is it's a seat height thing that he needs to adjust. He might need to go a setting lower, a setting higher, whatever it is. I think he could get that fixed. It could be a situation where maybe his shoulder width or just the length of his arms don't properly line up with it. And I would say that's more of a unique case. And oh, wait, it doesn't have science based in the title. I don't know if this is science based or not, but either way, personally, I would put that in S tier.
in B tier. I'll be picky and say B tier. All right.
Yeah, that is picky. I'd put it in S tier.
The cable lateral raise is incredible because as long as you set the cable at around hand height, it'll provide maximum tension on the side delt while it's most stretched.
Not most stretched, but or not in this clip at least. I'm not going to nitpick that.
That's because you get the highest tension whenever your arm and the cable
Yeah,
form a
right
90-degree angle. Perhaps more importantly, though, I find the cable lateral raise just feels excellent. You get that nice, even tension on your side delts throughout the range of motion. I personally find I can connect with my side delts even better if I use wrist cuffs. That's because
Yeah, don't let the biomechanics haters talk you out of something like wrist cuffs. They make a lot of sense. Jeff, you also look jacked. Your arm looks massive. So do your delts in that one. Jeez.
even though my grip won't be a limiting factor here, my forearms still get a big pump, and that takes away some of my focus from my delts. But then if I just have a floating hand with nothing to hold on to, it feels a bit awkward. So I hold on to a lacrosse ball with the cuff.
It seems like the most gimmicky thing, but I actually think I do agree with him on this. I think it's great. I personally don't do it just because I think it's a little bit overkill. If you just make a fist, I find that works. So you should just kind of make a fist and like tuck my hand like this, and it feels just as good. So if you don't want to use a lacrosse ball or something, just make a fist and you should be fine.
This might be too gimmicky for some of you, but I love them. You really can't go wrong with a cable lateral raise, whether you do them with a standard D handle or with cuffs, and that's why they're going straight to S tier.
Yeah, I'd put him in S tier. It really is great. It's one of those things where the first time I tried them, I was like, yeah, these are fine. They just feel like a lateral raise, like a dumbbell lateral raise. And then I went back to dumbbell lateral raises and I was like, oh, okay, I can see why this actually does feel a little bit better now. Either way, both great lifts.
In fact, I would say this is my favorite side delt exercise of all, making it the second reveal behind door number 2.
I would probably this would be in the conversation 100%. It would either be this or the seated lateral raise machine. It's kind of a toss up between those two. The cool thing about this is you have a little bit more freedom. The downside of this is you do have to do it unilaterally, which is a bit of a pain and takes more time, takes more mental energy, and you're less likely to want to just do more volume if needed. So I find that just having the bilateral machine, that just might give it the slight edge, but they're both, it really is a toss up. We're getting so nitpicky at this point.
The cable Y raise actually gives you an even bigger range of motion where you sweep the cable up and out and back. And it's also going in S tier. The only reason it isn't my number 1 pick is that some people do find them a little more awkward to learn. The behind the back cuffed lateral raise is the most gimmicky looking exercise that
One thing I would say is I did not specify. I do mine behind the back. If any of you guys watch my channel, you know I obviously do that, so I don't think I need to specify it. But yeah, behind the back, especially if you are raising 15, 30 degrees in front of your body, then that will get your rear hip out of the way. So you can just basically raise and the cable will go kind of like just over your butt, like around your lower back, and it works much better. You won't have it like kind of awkwardly pulling you forward.
I actually do, but I think it's amazing. Its main advantage over the standard cable lateral raise is that you get to knock out both arms at once, which is twice as time efficient. To set it up, just hook your wrists into the cuffs, optionally grab a pair of lacrosse balls, and step over one of the cables while spinning around and crossing the cables over.
That's why people don't do them. Nobody can figure out how to get into that actual position.
Behind your back. Then step forward and raise the cables out and slightly forward. Who cares what it looks like? If it works, it works.
Yes, I agree.
These are going in S tier. The banded lateral raise is my least favorite lateral raise option, and I rarely include it these days. Similar to the dumbbell lateral raise, it provides zero tension in the stretch and maximum tension at the top. Unless all you have is a band, I do think dumbbells, cables, or machine laterals would be a better choice. These are going in C tier.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Again, it kind of depends on the band. Like if it's a super light band, you can start it in a stretch and just do like more like a face pull variation and it works fine. Where the ascending resistance profile is just much smaller. But if it is like a heavier band and you're holding it directly at your feet and starting with literally no tension in the band, that's going to be very extreme. So I would agree with that. I mean, the only weird thing I'm seeing here is I don't know how I could put a banded lateral raise over a front raise, but I don't know.
The upright row is definitely an overhated exercise. It's going to target both the upper traps and the side delts with a little bit of biceps involvement. I prefer to do these on cables with a rope because I can sweep the handles out as I row. As long as you have healthy shoulders, there's no evidence that they contribute to shoulder issues. I'm going to put these in B tier as a delt builder.
Yeah, I'd probably say about the same. I prefer to do them with a barbell or an easy bar. That way you can use a little bit more. Not that you can't cheat with a cable, but it's a little bit easier to cheat with a free weight, I find. You can use a little bit of hip drive and go a little bit heavier. That kind of evens out the resistance profile a little bit. You can also adjust your grips because you're not just limited to the rope that's constantly trying to pull you in. If you go a little bit wider, there's less elbow flexions that won't tire out basically your forearms and all your elbow flexors and your biceps, which is fine. But overall, yeah, for the rope variation, not my first choice, but a barbell easy bar version, yeah, I'd say B tier is totally fine for those, if not A tier.
They don't rank higher because, even with the cables, the upper traps will start to take over, so it's hard to get the delt fibers to true exhaustion. They're still a great overall yoke builder though, and I am a fan of
I wouldn't say they're a great overall yoke builder. I think if we're talking like upper traps and get big, like I don't think an upright row is going to cut it. I think power shrugs and rack pulls, and I think most other lifts, you're probably wasting your time. Like they're big boy muscles. They can handle a ton of weight. It's a situation where they should be handling a ton of weight if you really do want to grow them optimally.
upright rows. The reverse pec deck is an amazing rear delt exercise. It provides consistent tension throughout the range of motion, and because your chest is braced, you'll be directing all that tension coming from the stack into your rear delts. I actually prefer to do these sitting sideways because you'll get a much deeper stretch. But the downside is that you'll need to do each arm one at a time. That means
And you don't have the chest support anymore.
it'll take a bit longer. You can superset each arm though, so while one side is working, the other side is resting, and you can just go back and forth without much rest in between. My instinct is to put these in A tier, but I think if you can lock in that sideways position, they deserve to be in S tier.
Yeah, I'd put them in S tier either way. It's the most stable, most easy lift to learn for training the rear delts, which are such a tough muscle to train because one, they're behind you can't see them. Two, they're surrounded by bigger, stronger, more jacked muscles all around. So getting the rear delts to really grow, I think it's a rare scenario where the mind muscle connection I think is really important, and just focusing on the sensation can be really important. Not because the sensation is going to drive growth or anything, but it teaches you how to feel your rear delts and get them to work. And then from there, you don't have to worry about that stuff as much. So it's a super valuable teacher. One of the things I tell all my clients who are doing rear delt work, one of the cues I usually put in for those lifts is like, just try and squeeze your rear delts, and that will teach you a lot. So I would put them in S tier, even if they're not length and bias, don't get a huge stretch, all that stuff.
Rope face pull will target the rear delts really well, especially if you set up the rope a little lower, take an underhand grip, and externally rotate your shoulders as you pull, kind of like doing a rear double biceps pose. My minor gripe, though, is that it's just really hard to get your mid traps to not take over. No matter what cues you use, your mid traps are going to be active. That's not necessarily a bad thing because you do want your mid back to grow as well, but then your rear delts might not be the limiting factor. Still think it's a great exercise to include since it'll give a big stretch on the rear delts, they feel good, and they're solid for overload. Rope face pulls are going in A tier for rear delt growth.
That's about where I put them. I did when I was growing my rear delts, I actually did a ton of band face pulls, and it was a very light band that I would just step back very far with. For some reason, it felt really good. I think it was because the grabbing the band was just like such a small grip, and I hate fat grips and like huge grips and thick barbells. I can't stand it for whatever reason. So using that thin band, it was a slightly ascending resistance profile, but I personally found that the mid back wasn't really working that hard. Maybe it's because it was much stronger and my rear delts would give out first. But I think if you really know what you're doing and you're probably more intermediate or advanced, you can really maximize a face pull and get a lot out of it for rear delts. For beginners, I can see where it's a little bit tricky trying to figure out if your rear delts are working or not. That's all I have to say there.
Bent over reverse dumbbell flies have the same problem as dumbbell lateral raises. Zero tension at the bottom when the delts are stretched. I still think they're a good option if you don't have access to cables or if you're really time constrained, and I actually still do them myself when I'm in a hurry. Oddly enough, my rear delts always get really sore from these too. They'd probably be in A tier, but because there's not quite enough tension in the stretch, I've got to knock them back to B tier.
They're more awkward to cheat with too compared to a dumbbell lateral raise, which is very important to take into account, I think. So cheating on those is super weird, super awkward. You won't be able to look in a mirror either because you're looking at the floor, and if you're looking at a mirror, you're too upright. You are doing a lateral raise. So the one knock I have on that is that the resistance profile is, yeah, it's not something I love, but with a lot of stuff for the delts, it either doesn't matter as much in my experience, or you can use an actual productive cheat that isn't at the cost of like fatigue or something like that. So it should be totally fine. Those reverse dumbbell flies, bent over version, I'd probably put them in C or B tier. They're really not great. I've never programmed them for someone else. I've done them myself, but I've never stuck with them even before I understood like resistance profiles and all that kind of stuff. They always just felt super weird.
All right, the reverse cable crossover. And
This is where it's at. This is a great lift. It's tricky to set up. It's one of those lifts where you have so many different setups that can work to where it's almost overwhelming, and it's best sometimes just to like pick one and go. But if you pick one and go and it feels good, yeah, it's an excellent lift. I really do like these. This is what makes me want to get a functional trainer, but I bought a pec deck instead. So
amazing stretch on your rear delts, especially if you cross your arms over at the top. Enormous range of motion.
that I don't think I have OCD, but having to put one arm over the other makes me think I have OCD. I just couldn't do it. You couldn't make me do that. There's no way.
With nice, even tension throughout the range. As long as you hold the cables themselves and not the handles, it should feel nice and smooth, and you shouldn't run into any clanging as your arms cross over. And then to avoid any left to right muscle imbalances, you can alternate which arm you cross over on top from set to set. As long as you focus on sweeping the cables out rather than yanking them back, you should feel a massive connection with your rear delts. These are amazing, and they're easily going into S tier.
Yeah, I agree.
And that also makes them the third reveal behind door number 3.
Over the rear delts, yeah. I would consider those. I would have to say I personally prefer reverse pec deck. The stability and the ease of setup is awesome. And personally, even though they are a little bit more length and bias depending on what cable station you're using and your setup and whatnot, I would probably prefer a reverse pec deck. And yeah, I mean the proof is that I bought one of those instead of buying a functional trainer or just getting a cheap cable. I went out of my way to get a pec deck.
As my number 1 rear delt builder. And if out of all these I had to pick one exercise as the worst of the worst,
Let me pick mine first. I don't want him to influence me at all. I would say military press. No, I'm kidding. I'd probably go bent rear delt fly or banded side raise. It would have to be one of those. If I had to pick one, I'd probably say, yeah, probably bent rear delt fly.
I guess it'd have to be the front raise, not because it's so
No, I disagree with them on that.
bad for muscle growth, but rather because I think it's redundant in most cases. It's still not bad enough to get into F tier though, because I do think it can have its place. And if I had to pick one exercise as the best of the best for overall shoulder development,
Oh, I already saw it move. You can see it's moved like 1 pixel. So I know what he's picking. If I had to pick one for overall shoulder development, I would say it's hard to not say Smith behind the neck press. but it is not on here, so I can't pick that. I mean, the delts, you can't pick just one because you're putting 3 muscle groups in one. It's like trying to say, what's the best lift for your biceps and triceps? Like, well, they each do their own thing. So I don't know. I can't just say one. Yeah, I'm not going to. I can't.
I think I'd go with the cable lateral raise. It's easy to do, it's super effective, and it ticks all the boxes for hypertrophy. Now, do you know the best and worst quad exercises for muscle growth? If
I think I do, but I'm not sure. Maybe I'll react to that one next. So either way, that's clearly it for the video. So we pretty much agreed on everything aside from a few nitpicky things. I think Jeff did a great job. I think there are a few really good lifts that were left out. So something like a behind the neck press and variations of that. I think that's a huge blind spot from the video. But overall, if you're looking for generally just like a quick go-to reliable tier list for you or to like share with a friend or something, yeah, I would full on recommend this. I think he did a great job. So yeah, with that being said, that's all I got for today. I will see you guys in the next video.